To relevant parts of your briefs. So if you could just start from the beginning, from paragraph 1.
Kia ora tātou.
Greetings everyone, members of the tribunal, and to the congregation here gathered.
My name is Patricia Ngatakutai Jacobs, and I'm a named claimant for the Ngati Wehi 1482 claim. I've been told that I descend from the ancestor Kowhata through each of his children, Henepare, Tahuri and Wehi. I understand that our tupuna had historical interest in and about the Rohe Potai district. My husband Jeremiah, Jerry, I noho ana I tōku taha,
On my side here.
significantly to this kōrero. A lot of the tribal knowledge is passed down to him from former generations and includes my mum and dad, uncles and aunties and other whanaunga living within Te Rohe Potai, Waikato, Tauranga Moana, Kapiti and other areas. Our claim is a tribal claim against Crown action and or lack of Crown action to protect our ancestral interests under Te Tiriti o Aitangi I te tau kotahi mano, warurau e whā tikau.
In 1840.
I came through our founding ancestor Wehi for and on behalf of his descendants, and in particular those descendants who have lived since our ancestor Ihakara Taharangi Tukumaru placed his tohu on the treaty document after hearing of its contents on Kapiti Island in 1840. I claim those portions of ancestral interest relevant to this inquiry so identified in a report commissioned by the Crown Forestry Rental Trust and completed by researcher Peter McBurney of Auckland, the 4th of March 2013. Unlike the ancestors I have named in my brief, I was born at Otaki, and within a month of my birth, 29th March 1948, I, my parents and 2 older sisters moved on to a dairy farm at Te Poi in South Waikato. For my mother it was a return, as she had already lived at Waikato and Tauranga Moana formerly. I spent the first 8 years of my life at Te Poi and attended Sawon School. 4 of my youngest siblings were born at Matamata. Ringaringa. Our farm at Te Poi was next to a marae we knew as Ringaringa. I remember people living there at the time. It was through my mother and her stepfather by adoption, Manahi Te Hiakai, that we were on that land in the first place. Our koro had no children of his own, and in 1926 he illegally adopted my mother, who was about 6 years old at the time. At the time of adoption, my mother's name of Hinera was extended to include the name of her stepfather, Manahi Te Hiakai. Manahi was also a brother to my mother's paternal grandmother, Apikaira Karawaputa. It was our koro Manahi who gave over 4 acres of land for Ringaringa Marae. I have since been told that the marae carried the name Ahi o Te Ao, and Ringaringa was actually the ancestor house that stood there. The 4 acres was given over to some landless Ngati Motai who were affiliated to the Kingitanga. The name of the whānau that lived there in my time was Liberty.
Mrs. Jacobs, if I could just interrupt you and direct you to paragraph 13 of your evidence.
Land records for Waikato of late 1800s, early 1900s will show our koro's name as Manahi Karawaputa, whereas for the same time, land records for the Rangitike Manawatu will show his name as being Manahi Paora. They are one and the same person, and each name is relevant to whānau names of either his father or mother. Paora Pohotiraha. Paora Te Umu Koko was our koro Manahi's father. Te Umu Koko was Paora's name at birth, and later in manhood he acquired the name Pohotiraha. My husband says this name was indicative of Paora's physical stature and that he was quite barrel-chested. Paora was born at Maunga Tautari, and as a young man, he and his brother Horopapera, Te Umu Koko, were part of a taua that travelled the direct route south to Kapiti around 1830. On arrival, the migrant taua acquired guns on tick from Ngati Toakin and cut flax, among other things, to honour the dead. They were participants at the 1834 pakanga o Hao Whenua between Ngati Raukawa and Ngati Awa. Ngati Raukawa were successful in driving that branch of Ngati Awa further south to take up lands around Hutt Valley in Wellington. At the time of Hauwhenua, Paora Pohotiraha was considered to be one of the leading men of Ngati Kaupata, and chief of a people known as Ngati Ihi Ihi, a sub-hapu of Ngati Wehi Wehi. The Ngati Ihi Ihi were occupying land in the Marautu at that time, having established a relationship with the tangata whenua through a woman named Hine Titi and a man named Te Rangi Otu. The marriage arrangements of these two tangata whenua to the Tainui migrants thus established both take tupuna and take raupatu rights for their descendants to occupy land.
Kia ora, Mrs. Jacobs. If I could just interrupt you again, and if we could skip over quite a large portion and go to paragraph 27.
By the time of the raising up of the first Māori king, Paora's mana as principal chief was beginning to wane, in that the young men of Ngati Kaupata, Wehi Wehi and others were desiring to support the new movement and were agitating the European settlers by implementing a road toll and other taxation system, which included the disbursement and, in some instances, the confiscation of stock should the relevant tax not be paid. It was well known that Paora was a loyalist, and he remained loyal to the Crown up until the invasion and eventual confiscation of those portions of Maunga Tautari. He lived out his life at Rotorua among his wife's kin and maintained ahika at Maunga Tautari by working the garden plantation they had there. He did this up until the time when age became a factor in his inability to maintain his inherent responsibilities. Paora, a chief of Ngati Wehi Wehi, died about 1875. Paora's wife was Rota Te Hiakai of Ngati Tuara.
If I could just read to paragraph 30.
Leading into the 1860s, the young men of Ngati Kaupata, Wehi Wehi and others left the Kapiti Manawatu lands to support the new king. Other ageing chiefs like Paora remained loyal to the Crown, but depleted of their workforce, the large plantations they had at Waikawa and the Manawatu soon deteriorated into smaller, manageable plots. However, news of the Waikato and King Country invasion by imperial forces inevitably invoked these people to return to their ancestral lands at Waikato and other parts of Maunga Tautari also. My husband also says the activities of those loyalists who returned to Maunga Tautari and protested the activities of the imperial and settlement forces amounted to little more than old people, widowed women and children. Their protest activities have been well documented, and even as those children grew into adulthood, they and their descendants continued to agitate and protest the Crown's activities for many years thereafter. Concerning the imperial invasion, confiscation and aftermath, there is no need to delve into what is already well documented. However, it might be noted that of those young tupuna who left the southern lands to actively participate in the defence of their ancestral land, not one of them returned. Several of their descendants either migrated or sent their children to whanaunga occupying lands in the south. My tupuna Henari Taratoa died in the fighting. He was the brother of Meremaihi. Meremaihi was my mother's great-great-grandmother. Meremaihi and Captain Roderick Gray had a son named Paddy. My grandmother, Omahi Gray, was Whare's daughter. Omahi is my mum's birth mother. My mum's birth father was Te Tauru Kaiapa Gardner. Tauru and Rawiri Gardner were sons of Apikaira Karawaputa and Singleton Gardner. Apikaira sent her sons in early 1900s to our Koromanahi living in the south. They became land owners under the new system of land tenure. My whānau inherited land interests through the above name with respect to the southern lands. Our koro's name in the kingitanga was Pōkai Tara Te Hiakai, and he aligned himself with the Kingi Mahuta and Te Parimata Māori, joining Te Rōpū Motuhake o Te Kingi. By 1917, our koro had been elevated to Ngā Mātariki o Te Whare Ariki, the top house, in status of Te Pika o Te Whare Ariki, Speaker of the House. He aligned himself with the kingitanga because of the sacrifice of his kingitanga forebears and the losses suffered by his generation of Waikato kin, who were feeling the aftermath of European military invasion and mass land confiscations. Early in 1919, Manahita and Rewati Te Whena, who was also of Ngati Wehi and a spokesman of the lower house, Kotahitanga, sought an audience with the English Crown through an impending state visit by Prince Edward, who was next in line to the throne. However, invitations for the Crown Prince to visit Otaki were turned down, and the engagement to take place at Palmerston North was cancelled. The assumption that Kotahitanga affiliations was a factor in the settler government decisions still holds strong and is worthy of further consideration, given that the surviving Ngati Kōwhata Wehi were all Kingite supporters by this time. Manahi and Rewati's response was to seek the services of a politically neutral whanaunga to engage the Crown Prince at a state-managed Rotorua venue and present him with 2 merepaunamu. The reciprocal gift was a rather large Royal Navy ensign flag. Manahi Te Hiakai and Rewati Te Whena ended up becoming hoha with the Kotahitanga because in their view one of its main purposes was to care for the dispossessed landless people, and Kotahitanga resources were being depleted in their attempts to engage the Crown through the new legal system. Followers of the Kotahitanga were starving, living in bivouacs, dying off in great numbers, disease-ridden and devoid of life-sustaining resources. While this was going on, a privileged few chiefs who had been awarded lands were still living well. So Manahi and Rewati removed themselves from the Kotahitanga movement. Rewati joined the Rātana movement while Manahi returned to Manukau, Otaki, living out the rest of his life there. Our koro died in 1936 before we were born. He was aged about 80 and his headstone depicts his Kotahitanga name. He is buried at Manukau at what is now known as Ngati Wehi Marae. In times past, this marae carried the name Kuru Kohatu Pā, and the meeting house that once stood there was Namu Tahi o Te Kingi, number 1 of the king, thereby acknowledging past Kotahitanga affiliations and the sacrifice of the young men of Kōwhata Wehi that left that place in the south and returned north in support of their king and kin. These particular ancestors were deemed to be rebels, and for whatever reason, none of them returned. That is reason enough for my standing here now, because I feel compelled to speak for them, those tupuna who did not return. The other reason I'm standing here, and perhaps the only reason I'm able to stand here, is because I also descend from an ancestor who was a loyalist at that time, which is Paddy. Ngati Kōwhata Claims Commission in 1881, our koro, using the name Manahi Paora, was part of a delegation of 7 people seeking to prosecute a personal claim for maunga tātari at Cambridge before the Ngati Kōwhata Claims Commission of that year. Included in this delegation was Manahi's sister Amelia Te Hiakai and their uncle Ihakara Tukumaru. Manahi also lay a tribal claim on behalf of Ngati Wehi. The tupuna who travelled down south left the lands in the hands of people they trusted. This was the tikanga. If I was going away, I would do the same, leave my lands with whānau that I trusted. Those people had every reason to go back. The first wave that came down were all fighting men who came down to see how their kin were going with the heke, leaving their women and children behind. They had every intention of going back, but they were invited down here and saw everything the land had to offer. However, despite the evidence of our tupuna, the Commission basically found that our people had abandoned their lands in the Waikato.
Just pause for a moment. Sarah, this is... I appreciate that this is all in the brief. This is addressing some of this material that we've heard quite a bit of detail about from Mr. McBurney and other kōwhata witnesses earlier. So perhaps if you help the witness through to the next important point of presentation.
Thank you, Your Honour. It's really to illustrate a wehi perspective on that as well, but I will direct Mrs. Jacobs to paragraph 46.
46? Taking what I have said in entirety, I now state that neither I nor my ancestors have ever abandoned any land, confiscated or otherwise. It might be said that for as long as our dead lay on that land, we are still connected to that land, and therefore have an inherent obligation to maintain a presence over that land. If you abandon your land, you take up your dead. That is the tikanga. For instance, when the Rangitike Manawatu block was sold, some members of Ngati Wehi took their dead with them, and even some of Ngati Upper's dead.
And if I could just direct you to paragraph 51. Thank you.
The failure by the courts and the Commission to recognise our tupuna's interests has had a major impact. The land is our whakapapa. For any Māori to be shoved off their land, which is what they're known, that is a very hurtful thing. There is a difference between abandoning one's ancestral land and being driven off it. The ancestral connection to land goes beyond title. As long as the bones of your ancestors are on that land, you will be connected to that land. What has happened in the Waikato has impacted upon the tribal knowledge. A major impact for this generation has been the loss of whakapapa and loss of knowledge. Growing up at Te Poi, we just thought of the families around us as different whānau, but now looking back, you can see that we were all one people. Land is whakapapa really. You realise that it is what binds us as a people, but if you don't know the whakapapa, the knowledge is lost, or it's just wasted.
And just paragraph 54. Thanks.
Our claim is really for those who don't know who they are, those who are lost out there. So many people don't have interest in land, do have land, but either they don't know it or they don't know how to utilise it. The old people used to say that this was our land, but they were talking about their ancestors. They knew where they came from, but we're not very good at explaining it. The most important thing is to honour our ancestors and have their stories told. That is a catalyst for people who don't know. Once you get the information out there, people start to recognise the names. When people don't understand the history surrounding the land, that does remain, and it limits progress. People don't know how to consolidate and utilise their lands. However, we, the current generation of Ngati Wehi, we only have limited resources to do that. Our tribal land resources equates to a 1 acre plot, and that is our marae at Manukau, held in trust for all Ngati Wehi. I hope that through the tribunal and the treaty settlement process, we can build on what we had to reach those people without the knowledge in honour of our ancestors. Kia ora tātou.